Welcome to the Starfish Storytellers, the podcast that makes a difference one story at a time by bringing storytelling to life.
The problem of Maria. I've spent my life trying to solve for X, Hispanic child born into a world divided into male and female, seeking the solution that will put me back together. My model is androgynous fusion of form, or amorphous, the formula of formlessness. I am anthropomorphous. Those who cry redundancy are not Hispanic, have not spent their lives affirming one gender over the other, describing themselves as others see them, puzzling the evidence that not all forces repel, sensing the magnetic pull of the poles, the measureless singularity of humanness, the genderless objects I anthropomorphize. When my parents immigrated, they changed their names, became pronounceable. Miguel became Michael. Pilar became Maria. I too became Maria. Maria, virgin, mother, queen, woman, every girl child in the family. Maria of mercy, Maria of sorrows, of charity, conception. Maria standing on a pillar. We went in vain by our second names. I did not like the name. It was a school-time necessity, a moniker to introduce me to strangers. I learned to disassociate. I learned the geometry of gender. Sets called girls and boys were closed, and I was bracketed. The curriculum did not allow for fluctuations. I learned that I was jealous of tomboys because they were more male than I learned that male meant climbing trees and dominating in sports. I read mysteries and stayed up late, solving for X. I took a job at a university. I admit the brideside appeal. Shrugged off my skirt, slipped on instead a name in slacks and button-down shirt. A chameleon takes on its surroundings. I forgot that I was not Maria, forgot I was a chameleon. The identifier long disdained wrapped herself around my body. No longer skirt disguised as uniform, stripped away each night. She infused my form, taught me to regard how others moved, laughed, discoursed in academic circles, taught my voice to speak her words, made me pronounceable. Say it soft. It's almost like praying. I became persona and personified her. It was disconcertingly easy in that world-renowned bastion of intellectual pursuits where denizens came and went with semesters. My fellows said, Maria will always be here. Maria stared back in the mirror, answered in my voice. Hers was the outline in the shadow I cast. My clothes could not contain her. Only I could do that. Solve for X. There is a line between what I know to be true and what I accept that others believe. And try though I may to merge sets, the problem of duality remains. I behave as if contenta and contento mean the same thing, and Ms. is just polite address, and a ponytail won't feminize me any more than Johnny Depp. I behave as if a closed set does not contain boundaries, and I exist whether or not I am observed, and the difference between X and Y is non-existent. Although some would say that is skirting the issue. I don't wear skirts. Somewhere one must draw a line and cross it when solving for X.
Hello, my name is Liana Henry, and welcome to the Starfish Storytellers. I'm the CEO of the Black Dog Group and your host. I'm passionate about storytelling and on a mission to raise up the next generation of storytellers. We're called the Starfish Storytellers after the moral of the Starfish story, which centers on the power of one. Because no matter how big the challenge, every action matters. One step, one starfish, and one story at a time. Every episode will welcome a new storyteller who will inspire and connect with you. So thanks for tuning in. Now let's get started. Today's episode is The Problem of Maria, Poetry, Identity, and the Power of Being Seen. And with me today is Pilar Quintana. Pilar is a multidisciplinary artist, poet, and educator whose work spans painting, photography, music, and performance. But at the heart of it all is storytelling through language and expression. Recognized as a Renaissance person, Pilar brings a deeply personal and creative approach to exploring identity, emotion, and human experience. This episode is deeply personal for me because in addition to being our guest today, Pilar is also my cousin. Actually, in many ways, more like my sibling. So it's really special for me to have them here for this conversation. As someone who has many close family members who identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community, creating spaces for these stories and for the people who tell them matters to me. As a poet, Pilar uses language not just to tell stories, but to create space for reflection, for complexity, for identities that don't always fit neatly into traditional definitions. Their work invites us to slow down, to listen differently, and to engage with stories in a more nuanced and meaningful way. Pilar also plays an active role in the arts community, helping others find their voices and express their own stories through creative mediums, fostering environments that are inclusive, thoughtful, and deeply human. So welcome to the Starfish Storytellers. Prima, I'm really happy you're here.
I am so thrilled to be here, Prima.
So Pilar, we start every episode with our guests introducing themselves. So do you care to share a bit more about who you are in your own words?
Sure. So I am a queer and genderqueer Cuban American poet and artist. I'm currently the vice president of the Arts Institute group of the Merrimack Valley, and I'm also a member of the Great Court Poets. Those who are listening who live in the New England area might have heard me read or give presentations at various libraries or colleges or at the Mass Poetry Festival. And on a more personal note, so I've always been interested in identity and self-expression and rather kind of obsessed with it, really. So I think about it constantly. I'm very conscious of how I'm perceived or how others perceive me. And that whole existential question of to what degree we intrinsically are or create ourselves, and to what degree we're created by taking on the perceptions of others and what they would like us to be. As a Latinx child of immigrants and someone who has never identified as the female that others expect me to be, I think it was probably very natural that from as far back as I can remember, I saw myself as other. And I became rather fascinated both with examining what otherness means and finding ways to communicate with the rest of the world, with those who are not other, who might not readily understand what it means or what it feels like to be me. I wanted to be seen. And I found that poetry and art are great languages to express things like cross-culturally. Poetry expresses feelings. So they might not understand what it's like to be me, but I can show them how it feels.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for sharing your poem. I heard it the first time when we were together doing a storytelling workshop at a local library. And I felt that my first thought was, where have I been all this time that I didn't know who they were? I think that is a lot of courage on your part to put your story in that poem that way. And I think that's the big part of storytelling in these spaces, in the LGBTQ spaces, is to open up that space for folks to be able to express who they are, because it just isn't easy. You know, storytelling doesn't always follow this linear path. And as you know, doesn't always fit into familiar structures, at least the way society has compartmentalized it into two genders. And sometimes it lives in fragments and rhythm and language, and it feels more like emotion than explanation. Poetry has a unique ability to hold complexity and to make space for identity, for contradiction, and for experiences that don't always have a clear definition. And doing so, like we said, it's going to allow people not just to be heard, but to be seen in a way that feels authentic and whole. And I'm looking forward to hearing you talk a little bit more about how to guide people in that form of storytelling, through poetry. So we live in a world where it often is asking people to simplify who they are. In these moments, I feel that your work is reminding us that there's power in embracing the full story. And even when it's not always going to resolve neatly in a little box. And that kind of storytelling can be incredibly meaningful, and especially for those who are still trying to find the words for themselves.
I heard something really interesting about poetry recently. I can't remember exactly where. I wish I could. It was a podcast or an audiobook that I was listening to, and it was actually about anxiety and neurology. So the speaker was explaining how poetry actually reduces activity in the amygdala, which is that response part of the brain there, the fight or flight part of the brain, which is responsible for emotions, including anxiety and fear. They were saying how poetry promotes relaxation because they were saying the part of the brain, right, that deals with language actually shuts down when a person experiences trauma. And that we have that expression, oh, there are no words, like when we're overcome and stuff. And they're saying that was very accurate because they said there are no words. The language center shuts down. And when one listens to poetry, which uses symbolism and imagery, it actually calms you down. So it helps you process those emotions that there are no words for. Like it actually helps you feel safe and whole when you express.
I think one of the things I'd love to hear from you is, because we talked about this in the workshop, about, I think sometimes when people think poetry, they think sort of very rigid definition. And I think what you were conveying in the class was that that's not true. That there are types of poetry, there's types of poetry, but just try it, like just do it. You don't have to not do it because so worried about the rigid box that poetry needs to fit into.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There are many different types of poetry. There's poetry that has very strict verses and these rules and meter and rhyme, but there's also very free flowing, free verse poetry where people can pretty much just express themselves using poetic language. I mean, to me, I think the most important thing that poetry does is that it allows people to say things that prose writing doesn't allow you to do. Like the way I describe prose allows me to describe a dance, for example. But poetry is like dancing with your audience and letting them experience the dance.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I totally agree with you. It's not a question of which form. It's not a question of getting bogged down in forms. It's just a question of expressing yourself poetically, letting that poetic voice come out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to hear your origin story. And I think the listeners would love to hear it too. You're a multidisciplinary artist. You paint, you do photography. I have your art in my home, music, and poetry. But poetry in particular feels like such a personal form of storytelling for you. When did you first discover poetry as a way to tell your story? And what drew you to it as the form of expression for you?
I think it's pretty much what I was just talking about, that poetry allows me to really express how I feel. I think there are things that you can say in poetry that you just can't say any other way. Especially when we're talking about writing. I mean, art, of course, is another way of visual arts or other sorts of art forms are another way, of course, of expressing oneself, expressing things that can't be expressed easily in language. or written language at least. But as far as the written languages go, I think poetry allows for a freedom of expression that prose does not. It allows you to express how something feels, not just what it is.
How old were you when you wrote your first poem? Do you remember?
Yeah.
Do you remember what your first poems?
Can't really recite it at this point, but I do remember that it was about my father being very big. And it was, I was 5. I mean, I don't think I wrote it, which is why I say maybe I was 5, because I started learning how to write when I was 5 or 6. I think I just said it, but it was a rhyme. I was just copying, rhyming, It was in English. So I was past nursery school, but yeah, I was young.
Mm-hmm. That's early. So you experimented early. We opened the episode with your poem today, The Problem of Maria, and it is a really powerful layered piece. So when you're writing poetry like that, are you even thinking about storytelling? Is that something that you're consciously shaping, or is it just emerging more sort of intuitively through the language and the rhythm and the emotion that you're sharing?
Both. So sometimes I have to admit, sometimes I go into a poem knowing exactly the story I want to tell. And the poem we're talking about here, The Problem of Maria, was like that. I knew the title. Well, I stole it from The Sound of Music, but I knew the title before I started the poem. I heard that phrase and I started thinking about mathematics and what I was like as a child and how my identity continues to emerge throughout my life. And it's just been an ongoing problem for me to solve. But sometimes I set out to tell one story and I actually end up telling another. Because poetry can be like that. It tells us what it wants to say sometimes before we even know we want to say it or need to say it. And I actually have another poem that I'd like to read that started out like that. It's a poem called White Woman. And when I first started writing the poem, I intended it to be about race. I moderated a poetry panel on Latinx poetry for the National Hispanic Heritage Month a couple of years ago. And it focused on identity and belonging and otherness. And one of the things we talked about was race. Some of the poems the panelists shared dealt with being marginalized because of the color of your skin, or they talked about losing or compromising their identities by trying to appear more white, wearing different clothes, straightening their hair. And they talked about wanting to reclaim their identities as people of color. Well, I mean, I come from a place of privilege because I pass for white. I often have in my life, especially when I was young and desperate to fit in. And when people meet me, I mean, even fellow Hispanics, they almost always assume I'm white, non-Hispanic. And even though, I'm fully aware of the privilege that this has given me and that I can never truly understand what Black and Brown people have to deal with every day, I'm going to say something I'm kind of embarrassed to say right now. But I have sometimes envied darker skinned Hispanics because they can't pass for white. And don't get me wrong, if passing wasn't a great advantage, we wouldn't do it. So I'm not saying for me, I can pass for white and negating how much harder it obviously is not to be able to pass for white, to never have the luxury of that temptation. But I gave into that temptation as a young person, a child, a young adult. And I sort of lost myself in the process. I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere really. And those feelings of non-belonging have sort of defined me over time. And I still feel that way today. It's self-negating to deny oneself. But I actually think that's how many of us live if we have our feet in 2 or more cultures, whether it's race or sexual identity or gender. We don't fit into the group we're assigned, but we don't fully fit into the dominant group either. So I always had a problem with being myself or even trying to figure out who myself was. And a big part of that had to do with my race and gender. how I was perceived as opposed to who I was, and how that informed from a very young age my sense of self and my ability or reluctance to be my authentic self. And I wrote the poem White Woman about my experience being perceived as both white and a woman, but actually being a genderqueer Hispanic. I wrote it after hearing about a friend's experiences as a Black man. He's biracial, but his father is Black, but he looks white. And how awkward it can be for him to pass for white. And my poem started out as a poem about race and passing, but it ended up being about me and gender and passing, because passing in order to fit into the privileged class is tempting if you can pass. This is White Woman. I am like a Black man who can pass for white. They tell Black jokes in front of him in white society. He plays the role. It's too hard to keep explaining himself. It's too inconvenient. Or maybe he just doesn't mind being mistaken for white, except he does. It's a drag. Every now and again, someone learns his secret and tries to be kind and calls him brother. That makes things even more difficult. He doesn't know how to respond as a Black man. His white skin blushes. It behaves as he was taught it needed to in order to mingle with society. And the hardest group of all are those like himself, those who can pass for white. They criticize him for not doing the things they themselves do not have the courage to do, or for not doing the things they have indeed found the courage to do. They are not the same, those like himself. They are in gray territory, passing for white, passing for Black, acknowledging that they are neither, trying desperately to explain to those who have never felt a need to question that things are not always what they seem, that a rose by the same name is sometimes a tulip in disguise, that the rules do not apply. They do not know the rules that do. And so they try on one outfit after another, looking for one that fits and wondering why it looks funny on them in the mirror. Some tear off the garments and parade proudly in ill-fitting clothes that suit them better. Some stand on the sidelines and mock what they are afraid they might understand. And some tie buttons that face in the wrong direction, take a long, hard look in the mirror, step out into the world, and pass for white.
When did you write that? Was that 2020?
No, that was, I can't remember now, several years ago. Probably around 2008 or 9, I'm guessing.
2008 or 9?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Wow. Well, we've come so far.
Yeah, I know.
I've experienced some of this as well. I obviously pass for white. I sound white. I am white, but I've walked that line. I think after my parents got divorced, I went through sort of an identity crisis, not crisis, but sort of really looking at my identity and who did I identify with? And I identified with my Cuban heritage. And I remember after graduating from college when I became a social worker, and I started working with Latino families in Lawrence and Lowell and Springfield and all in the area of Massachusetts. And I remember walking in, and my Spanish was not strong. Sometimes I feel like I don't practice enough. I need to practice more. And because I was working with families from so many different countries, South America, the Caribbean, I was picking up all these dialects. So it was sort of this hodgepodge of when I would speak. And I remember walking in one time and I started to speak to someone because these families only spoke Spanish. And they stopped and they looked at me and they said, "What are you?" Not who are you, but what are you? And I felt like I was always apologizing for having been born in Cuba and raised here. So, I have the hips, I have the lips, I have the curves, but I felt like I wasn't Cuban enough for them. And then on the American side, obviously, well, my story right now as to why we're where we are seated currently. But I remember a conversation with a friend, and she said, I thought you were different. Your face looked different, the way you sounded looked different, it sounded different. And that having that one foot in each culture and trying to, like you said, solve for X. I have to be both things. I want so much to embrace that Cuban American side, Cuban side. But as Cuban living in America, I have to embrace both.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. I think to some degree, one always feels like I'll never be American enough to be American, but I'll never be Cuban enough to be Cuban either. I'm going to take that back just a little bit because I do believe that Cuban Americans are American. We all know what I mean. Mm-hmm. That kind of, WASP background American that people think about. It's the same reason, the same way that I use the word white, for example, in that poem. And when talking about white America, I'm talking about white as opposed to, Hispanic. I'm not talking just about the shade that one's skin is. I'm talking about the whole idea of white America, which is kind of very anti-Hispanic in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly is currently. So let's touch again on your poem Problem of Maria. So we've been talking about it. I just love it. I really truly felt like I got to know you during that workshop. And you laid out a powerful thread around names, identity, expectations placed on folks culturally and socially. I have to say, as a side, one of the things that I've always struggled with is my name has always been pronounced incorrectly. And I'll, never find a pencil in the souvenir shop with my name on it, and always correcting people. And there'd be periods of my life where I would just not bother correcting them because it felt like I was always correcting people and they would still get it wrong. And so I find that I'm all about honoring the pronunciation of people's names as they are and not changing them. I know when you talked about in your poem, you talked about your parents changing their names because at that time they needed to. There was no way to assimilate if you didn't do that. But, if I go into a nail salon and there are Korean women in there and they're named Jane, I will stop and say to them, help me pronounce your beautiful name correctly. And if they say, Nguyen Kim, then I will call them by their name. That is their name. Their name is not Jane. They've made it convenient for their customers, but that is not the name that they were given. So when you think about the stories we inherit from family, from the culture that we are in, from the society that we're in, what does it take to carry them, reshape them, and then let them go?
And so I think I have another poem that does those three things. One of the most painful things that I've had to deal with in my life is my journey through gender. My inability to see myself as others see me has been a constant struggle for me from an extremely young age. I am well aware of what is expected of me from my family, from my cultures, all of them, from the religion I grew up in, and most especially from society, and especially, as we've been saying, today's increasingly intolerant society, or governing body at least. But I said that I was often happy to pass for white as a young adult. I was never happy to pass for female. And yet I did. I was born at a time when transitioning was not as common and the results were not as spectacular as they are today. I was also born at a time before the internet, so perhaps there were incredible options out there for me, but I was entirely unaware, living in a smallish town in Massachusetts. I didn't know any transgender people when I was young. And that's actually one of the reasons that I think being visible is so important. It's the reason why I wanted to focus on my gender poetry for this LGBTQ plus episode, because the transgender or non-binary community is often marginalized, even within the LGBTQ plus community, and they're certainly the most discriminated against, the most likely to be victims of violence, and the most likely to commit suicide. I myself have not chosen to seek medical intervention at this stage in my life. I've also come to realize that although I would have preferred a male body to a female one, I will always be genderqueer. I don't really fit either of the binary models very well. But the poem that I'm about to read now starts off very binary. It starts off in a time when I thought there were only two genders, and given a choice between the two, I chose male. Although I seem to subconsciously know that it wasn't as simple as that. And the poem is called Scooter, and it's a poem in parts. So part one. When I was young, I played with Barbies. My brothers played with G.I. Joes, but they were too angry and brutish for me. There were Ken dolls with their sculpted chests, but they didn't look like anyone I knew. Neither did Barbie, with her hard, strange, protruding breasts and unnaturally angled feet. My favorite was Scooter, a preteen Barbie, but I didn't know that. Scooter looked right. Flat chest and flat feet, boyish waist and sun-kissed freckles. She wore her hair in ponytails, which I took down, cut her hair so it brushed her shoulders. It was, after all, the summer of love. Took her swimming in the bathtub. She had a two-piece suit, boy shorts on bottom, cut-off tank up top. I let her swim topless. Sat her on the edge of the tub, her arm around the skipper doll, with her long blonde hair wet and clinging to her pretty one-piece. I forgot to remove them after my bath once. My mother found them. She never mentioned it, but I knew it was wrong. Knew I should not have let her see shirtless Scooter with his arm around his girlfriend. Part two. I remember it vividly. The day I woke up to breasts. Well, not exactly, but I looked in the mirror and my nipples had changed overnight. Grown, I noticed with alarm. They protruded from slightly swollen skin. I knew what it meant. Knew that no one must see them. I reached for a shirt, told myself, never will you go shirtless again. Petrified my family would ask why I was wearing a shirt. My life now revolved around two budding, unwelcome orbs on my chest, proclaiming me feminine before anyone had a chance to ask. I hid them for as long as I could. I lied about them just like they lied about me. Until the day my mother noticed nipples demanding acknowledgement under my shirt and bought me a bra with my siblings in tow. Like Hester Prynne's baby covering her scarlet letter in vain, the very bra they gave me to conceal my breasts served to draw attention to them, albeit in a socially acceptable way. Did the bra feminize me more than the flesh it covered? A question I would spend the rest of my life asking. As I hid behind cloth, behind flesh, well, I was expected to hide. Women go to jail for exposing their breasts. Part three. The day I went topless on South Beach, I was approached by a man, 30-something, Middle Eastern accent. You'll get burned like that. Aren't you afraid? The question hung between us. I had watched men like him on the beach for years, the water licking their chests, the sun warming their skin. I had envied them their freedom to feel. I had covered my chest, not from the sun, but from the shame of flesh that needed hiding, removing, denying. I covered my chest out of fear of being discovered. Today, I had discovered that the sun feels different on skin it has never touched, and that skin once touched never forgets. I looked at my accuser's fleshy chest. So long had I looked at chests like his and striven to forgive myself my own. Today, I refused to forgive or to condemn. My suntanned breast stood defiant. Parts of an imperfect body, yes, but no longer the defining part. That part lay deeper still, in the breast of a boy girl, staring at department store dolls who knew that no matter what the packaging said, Scooter was a boy.
Mm. And when did you write that one?
That's a good question. Probably around 2015 or so. I could look that up, but I don't remember. Probably around 2015 or so, I would guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you are not just a poet, you're an educator. You also help others find their voice through art and expression. When you're teaching or working with others, how do you help someone who may not feel like a storyteller begin to express their truth through art? I mean, are you even thinking about that when you're working with someone?
I mean, there are tools for telling a story, even if you're not particularly thinking about doing it. So one of the things I love to do is to create ekphrastic art or poetry. These are works that are created in response to another work of art. So, for example, sometimes a poem will move me and I will want to express what I feel about it in a painting. Or sometimes a painting moves me to the point where I want to sit down and write a poem about it, about how I feel about it. And the funny thing is, and maybe this is just me, but whenever I start writing about something that moves me, I invariably end up writing about myself. So, but I do think that oneself always shows up in a poem or a painting. It doesn't matter what the actual subject is. I think one always brings something of themselves into the work. So if a person's having a hard time telling a story, I would say, don't focus on yourself. I mean, write about something else. Don't just write about it. Tell me how it makes you feel. Tell me why. Tell me what you wish it could give you. Tell me why you hate it, why you love it, why you're indifferent to it. It doesn't matter. There's no wrong answers, but if you tell me what it is that you're feeling, if you put those feelings out there, then you're speaking your truth. You're telling your story.
Obviously, this episode is part of our Pride series, and we've mentioned that we create space for the LGBTQ plus storytellers and their experiences. So, from your perspective, what does true inclusion look like? I mean, not just in art, but in everyday life. And can storytelling, or how can storytelling move us toward that?
Yeah, I have a story for this. um, okay, so I have a brother who I am quite close to, but I never felt comfortable coming out to him as trans male or non-binary because I knew how he felt about gender. And then one day I heard him talking on the phone in another room, and he was talking about how gender is a genetic fact, and he didn't get this whole they pronoun thing. There were two genders. And I started feeling really uncomfortable. And I guess I got worked up enough that I also started feeling very reckless. And I walked into his room after he hung up and I said, I prefer they pronouns. And I told him how I never felt female even before I started kindergarten. And I told him that I couldn't explain why, but I knew from experience that it's entirely possible to feel like a male, even if you were born with female genitalia. And we talked about how a lot of the physical attributes that we associate with gender are hormone related, like developing breasts and body hair, and baldness and muscle strength. And I knew trans males who were on gender affirming hormone therapy, and I defied anyone to guess that they were assigned female at birth. I mean, they looked and sounded just like my brother's friends and business associates. And he seemed a little doubtful about that last bit. So I told him, Google on your own trans males and just look at the images and see if you can spot the trans males. And I told him that I myself had not opted for hormone therapy, but at one time I would have loved to. And although I never would have been the most masculine male, I mean, it would have been the same gender non-conforming male I am today in a different body, because I'm not a binary person, which is why I prefer they pronouns. My brother came back to me later that day and he told me that he had gone online and searched trans male images and that no, he would not have pegged many of them as trans male. And then we didn't talk about it again. So fast forward several years, and my brother is writing an email introducing me to a business associate. We work in a family business together. And he CCs me on it. And I notice that when he's referring to me, he writes, they are the person who usually handles these things. And I was stunned. I mean, I reread it over and over. I mean, he was using they pronouns for me with a colleague, not bothering to explain it or anything. He just did it like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I went to his office and thanked him. And he smiled and said, I'm trying. And that's what inclusion looks like to me. And people who may not fully understand what it is that you're going through or what your experience of life is like, but who love you or respect you, or maybe just show you the common decency of recognizing publicly who you are. I mean, I don't really think it's our responsibility as other to constantly educate everyone, but I do think that the more people who hear our stories, the more people we allow to see us, the more people will understand or at least respect us. They'll see us as just another acceptable way to be.
That's huge. Because in the email, he said, they are the person.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes people could say, yeah, I'm going with them sort of as a plural, but not as sort of the defining pronoun. So that's huge. Mm-hmm. I know your brothers, and so I know how huge this is. So kudos to them. So as we're getting ready to wrap up, I always like to ask our guests to speak directly to our listeners and to give them some pointers. So for our listeners who may be on their own journey, whether it's around identity, expression, or just want to simply feel seen, what would you say to someone who's still trying to find the words for their own story?
Experiment. I mean, you might not even use words, as we've been saying. It might be music or art or dance. It might be what you wear. It might be all of those things. You might be a Renaissance person like me, but everyone has a story to tell. So find your voice and use it.
It's a great tip. Thank you. Well, I could talk about this all day, but then this podcast would go on all day. So that is all the time we have for today, Pilar. And thank you so much for joining us and reminding us that storytelling can happen boldly on a page or a stage, but it also happens in the quiet work of finding the right words, embracing who we are, and allowing ourselves to be seen one poem at a time.
Thank you, Prima. It was wonderful to be here.
Thank you. And to our listeners, whether you've first heard us locally through BTV studios in Bedford, Massachusetts, or you're tuning in from across the globe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Amazon Podcasts, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time. Happy storytelling!